Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another edition of Janus Academy. This time we'll be talking about the 15th lecture in our series of historical analogies. This one is going to be dedicated to pointillism and divisionism on one end, and optical art or op art on the other. This is a very interesting one and took a while to bring together because these two periods are very similar, but they are very different at the same time. I will try to explain what we're talking about. Of course, we are going to focus on their similarities rather than anything else. So I want to begin by anchoring this whole thing, this whole story, as we did in previous lectures, into this very present tendency, very present in the whole of the 20th century, as well as the 19th century, as well as partially in the late 18th century. We are, of course, talking about Gothic revival, not just as architectural and pictorial style, but also as the philosophical and ideological principle. So when we're talking about the Gothic revival, we are talking about Gothic symbolism, Gothic ideas. For all, we're talking about medieval ideas, because as we know, Gothic style came from the medieval period. And the thing I want to turn to right away is the fact that was already mentioned in previous lectures when we were talking about pointillism and divisionism, is that light has a very important presence in Impressionist and Neo-Impressionist or Post-Impressionist paintings. More specifically, pointillism and divisionism painters sought to increase the quantity of light in their paintings. This is what they wanted to do. So they were basically deconstructing colors, they were deconstructing forms, and indeed perception as such, so as to better understand how light functions, so as to better understand how colors behave, and so as to infuse the canvas with more light than was previously thought possible. Now, of course, we're not going to get into the whole symbolism of light. We already covered this. By now, this is well known. We just want to say that the very principle of this is very important. The principle being that they wanted to bring more light into their art, but the way they wanted to do it was very scientifical. They wanted to understand color better. They wanted to understand what they see better, deconstruct it, analyze it, synthesize their discovering, and then apply it. So you could say that scientific method and scientific findings were something that really shaped this entire stylistical formation. And nothing is more truth than when we're talking about optical art. This is a very strong connection that these two stylistical formations share, because they're both very invested in scientific method. And the eras where they take place, we're talking about late 19th, to a certain extent early 20th century, and then second half of the 20th century's 50s and 60s decades. We are really talking about a society that is very much influenced by both the science and the industrial process, and of course the fact that industrial process has harnessed a lot of scientific discoveries, a lot of scientific thought, and a lot of scientific principles. And this is something that is very important to observe. Now, when we're talking about the scientific method, we already discussed how it was different in case of medieval art and how it was different in case of modern art. We already discussed how the scientific method grew out of the medieval period. We're not going to go back to that. What we are going to do is we're going to focus on one very important aspect of scientific method that has more to do with so-called hard sciences or natural sciences than it has to do with soft or social sciences. And the method in question really is experiment. We are talking about two very experimental stylistical formations that are very much invested in the notion of not only experiment, but really trial and error. This idea that if you want to understand something, or you want to invent and discover something, if you are engaged in scientific work, you truly go through empirical evidence, you make experiments, you observe them, you try to draw conclusions from them, then you do them again and again and again and again until you reach the desired effect, the desired result. Of course, this is a very unattractive part of scientific work. Those of us who are scientists know that you can spend years or decades or sometimes even longer than that trying to do something, going through endless repetitions going through endless tweakings of your repetitions of your intents until you reach something. And it's a very interesting thing to add that in hard sciences as well as in soft sciences, but I would argue in hard sciences probably more, entire scientific careers are sometimes spent in experimentation without ever achieving actual results. And this is something that is not wasted effort. This is important to understand, that if you spend your life trying to do something and you don't do it, someone who comes after you will not spend all of their time trying to do that same thing, because you've already done it and they don't need to repeat your work. So what you've done is not necessarily error, it's not necessarily a waste of time, it's just saving someone else's time. And this is also valuable scientific work. But that aside, we want to focus on experiment and we want to focus on repetition, because these two things are very important visually speaking. When we're talking about pointillism and divisionism on one end, and when we're talking about optical art on the other, we can see clearly that this is a type of process, a type of art that deals heavily in repetition. Indeed, the very move of creating pointillist painting is that you apply dots. Now, this is a very repetitive action. You can think about applying thousands of dots in a certain sequence, and this is a very different thing than sweeping a brush across the canvas, which is arguably far more interesting and far less repetitive, although it too involves a fair amount of repetition. But in here, when we're talking about the pointillist painting, just the very fact that we are creating or we are observing a pointillist painting makes us think of repetition, because we think of an artist that had to do this move many, many, many times. Now think about entire careers being spent doing this, pointing dots and applying them on the canvas. So a lot of repetition. If you're looking at optical art, many different examples, we're going to probably put a lot of them on the screen as I'm talking about this. You will see that repetition is a very important part of the entire process, not just visually, but also technically, and I would argue philosophically too. It's this idea that you repeat and repeat and repeat until you get to a certain solution, until you get to a certain result. And it also comes from the scientific background of both of these art and stylistical formations. It comes from this idea that through repetition, you get to a desired result. Now, there is a completely different way in which you can regard the repetition. You can look at it not from a scientific side, but from a religious and spiritual side. And I would argue that this is equally important. Because if you think about what ritual is, ritual really is an action that has been repeated enough times for it to be encrusted, for it to be imprinted into the very fabric of the community that creates that ritual. So there's no ritual without repetition. And when something is repeated enough times or long enough a time, it becomes a ritual. And the best rituals, we can argue, or the most sacred ones, the most precious ones, are the rituals that have been repeated so many times that we have lost all idea of their beginnings. They are lost in the mist and sands of time, if you will, and we don't really know how they initiated, we don't know how they began, we just know that repeating them is vitally important for the very structure, for the very survival of our community. These rituals tend to be more appreciated, I would say, than the ones that we establish ourselves and the ones where we can trace their origin very easily and very quickly. Now, you can connect this also to the mythical worldview. You can connect this to pagan worldview as much as you can connect it to Christian worldview. This is why I said this is not just a religious topic, it's also a spiritual topic. The important thing being is this connection that you can observe between scientific way of thinking on one end and then spiritual, be it religious in Christian key or be it the spiritual in pagan key, importance of repetition. And this is something that is really important for both of these arts, for both pointillism, divisionism, and then on the other end optical art, because they have a very strong spiritual dimension. Not to get into the whole thing how all artistic expression always carries a spiritual dimension, even if an artist thinks of themselves as being strictly secular, even if they are militant atheists or something of that sort, they also create something that has a very strong spiritual dimension and very strong spiritual imprint, even if they specifically don't want it to be that way. So we can say that this is something that is a very important thing to observe before we get on to the next topic. And the next topic really is the fact that these two stylistical formations are situated in two different eras. We're talking about modernity and we're talking about post-modernity. And this is something that really is incredibly important to address. If we're talking about modernity, we're talking about the generally speaking era of great ideas, of great projects, of great ambitions, arguably great enthusiasm. So great projects like nation building, like revolutions, both political and economic. This idea that you can create the world anew. So you could say that the peak of modernity really happens in revolutions, be they the French Revolution or the American Revolution or the Bolshevik Revolution. These are all ideas on how to create a better world. Of course, these revolutionaries would not necessarily agree with one another, not completely at least, on what this new world needs to look like, what it needs to be like, but the intent is the same. Enthusiasm is the same. It's this desire that you want to create new world, you want to make the world a better place, and you're willing to move mountains and willing to change the universe for that to happen. So this is a very optimistic, positive, and very entrepreneurial, if you will, take on things. On the other end, we have postmodernism, which is exactly the opposite to all of this. It's something that comes after modernism and something that, again, is burdened by the heritage and by direct influence of both World War I and especially World War II, where, as we already addressed, we had the events like the Holocaust, like the usage of the nuclear weapon, and many other atrocities that were never before seen. So we could say that humanity really took a strong halt and started examining itself much more closely after World War II. Now, when I say humanity, of course, I refer mostly to the Western Europe and its transatlantic counterpart. So I'm not talking about the entirety of the world because that is a completely different situation and a completely different story. I am talking about the part of the world that was mostly consumed and mostly marked by World War II and everything that came out of it. So postmodernism really comes as this thorough re-evaluation, recapitulation, questioning of everything that happened in our civilization, everything that happened before. We say we perhaps don't deserve a better world. We perhaps don't deserve to even exist at all. Something is terribly wrong with our situation. Something is terribly wrong with our culture, civilization, the way we live. So you could say that there's no more place for grandiose ideas, for enthusiasm, for optimism. This is inherited by a lot of doubt, a lot of cynicism, a lot of deconstruction, I would say, quite literally, of things that were made before. And if you're looking at post-structuralist, postmodern philosophy, you are looking at literally deconstruction, this, by the way, the name of it, of grand ideas, of ambitious ideas that came before that. And this is a way for us to observe these two arts, because as we said, these two stylistical formations, as we said, they come from same roots, they come from same, I would say, neo-medieval impulse, but they take very different directions, not only in terms of visuals and how they are developed, but also in terms of spiritual background and in terms of end result. So many similarities and some key differences, out of which we already addressed one. Now, if we want to properly understand this entire thing, we need to understand that optical art was heavily inspired, and this will be the case with some other arts that we're going to discuss later, like conceptual art, etc. It is heavily influenced by linguistics and by usage of language. It follows this general tendency of art to try to liberate itself, to simplify itself, to reduce itself to the most bare bone, focused and condensed message possible. It really seeks to shed everything that is a surplus. It seeks to become pure in this particular manner. And you can see that this tendency is again incredibly medieval or neo-medieval, if you will. This whole idea that art needs to disassociate itself from matter, from material presence. And you can connect that back to pointillism. You can say that this is what the artists were trying to do when they were trying to infuse paintings with more light, more and more and more light. This was the whole idea that you can again see in the Gothic interior, the difference between the painted wall that uses earthly colors and then the stained glass window that uses heavenly, spiritual, bright colors that are infused with light. So it's this whole idea that art needs to become next level. And next level in this particular case means shedding the shackles of matter, of material presence, shedding everything that is surplus, and reaching the next level of simplicity, clarity, directness. So you could say that this type of art really is heavily involved in communicating what art is to be all about. And if we're talking about visual arts, and we are talking about plasticity, something that is, well, visual to begin with. We are talking about something that we perceive with our sense of vision. So we say that this type of art really strongly focuses on that, using the scientific method, using the heritage of pointillist and divisionist art. And we are saying that it wants to bring us a very pure, simplified message that is visual in its core. This is exactly what's happening. But to do this, it basically takes hints from language. And it takes hints from language, most importantly, as a science system. So I would talk of language rather through a linguistical point of view than from a philological point of view. So for those of you who are confused, what's the difference? I will just say that linguistics is a science that treats language as a structure, as a system. It is very invested in grammar and many other technical, I would say, structural aspects of the language. Whereas philology is more interested in literature and artistic usage of languages. So it's basically the difference, I would say, metaphorically, that we see in physical interest in the human body that would exist with medical practitioner on one end and the visual artist on the other. So you're not interested in the human body the same way, you're not interested in the human anatomy the same way if you practice medicine, or on the other end, if you practice visual arts. If you're a physician, you will have a certain interest in the structure of the human body and how it functions and what it does. If you're an artist, you will also carry, if you're a formalist, let's say formal artist who is interested in formal representation, you will carry also an interest in human anatomy, but from a different point of view. So this is a very approximative and metaphorical explanation, but I think it serves our purpose for the moment. So if we're talking about the whole period after World War II, which is when optical art emerges, we are talking about postmodern period where we get to doubt and criticize and rethink everything that we wanted to build up to that moment. So if we're talking about optical art, we are talking about art that does not deal with reality, and this is really important to understand. It deals with an illusion. Now, it may seem very obvious if you're looking at examples of optical art that it's highly simplified, it's highly abstract, it's something that doesn't really speak of observable reality, but we are not only talking about what we see, we are talking about the substance of what is represented, and this cannot be stressed enough, that this is the art that deals with the illusion, because this is where optical art diverges very strictly and very importantly from pointillism and divisionism, because those two are interested in reality or super reality even in a certain way, as we've discussed in the lecture that was dedicated to it. Whereas this is the type of art that takes all of the building blocks that were provided and shaped by pointillism and divisionism and uses them to create something else entirely. So we are talking about visual deconstruction of reality as such, so as to create an illusion. And this is a really, really important thing, because not many artists will willingly and clearly state that they are dealing with an illusion. You could argue that for many centuries or thousands of years even, art dealt with the sacred. And we already discussed the sacred as a super reality. So not something that is fictional, far from it. Actually, it's the next level of reality. Now, you can also say that this was not the case just in thousands and thousands of years of art, in prehistoric art, in periods of time where we don't even know if we can properly apply the term art to begin with. We are also talking about this when we are talking about the 20th century. Like, for example, when we're talking about surrealism, or when we're talking about abstract art. Or if we're talking in a certain way about abstract expressionism or action painting. So we're always talking about some form of super reality. Even if we go back to neoclassicism, that we already covered, is very connected to analytical cubism, we are talking about this idea that art represents a superior take on reality. It represents a higher form of reality, perfected, not necessarily embellished, but more concentrated, I think, more substantial and richer in essence take on reality. It's this basic idea that the Greeks had, how gods live in super reality, condensed form of reality, which for them was constant ecstasy. That is a whole other thing. So this is what art is supposed to convey us. Now, in this particular case, it's completely the opposite. We throw all of that away. Art does not deal with reality at all. It doesn't deal with super reality. It doesn't deal with regular, ordinary reality. It doesn't deal with reality at all. It deals with an illusion. And this is an important thing. This is something that we need to address, and I think this is going to be the basically bulk of our entire lecture. Because, as we said, World War II produced this idea that reality was highly questionable, that reality was entirely corrupt, that we have produced some truly tremendous horrors, and that we were on the verge of destroying ourselves. Again, we need to remind ourselves that this is the context of the Cold War. This is the context of McCarthyism in America, Stalinism in Soviet Union. So we have this great economic prosperity on one end. We have the whole space race ramping up. We have these amazing discoveries, very exciting discoveries. But on the other end, we have constant fear that humanity will just blow itself into smithereens, that we shall not live to see tomorrow. So we already addressed this great dichotomy that existed in this particular period. The point is that many people felt, not to say the entire world, but part of the world that we're discussing here, felt that there was something tremendously wrong with reality as such. And you could argue that the decision to not deal with reality at all is to a certain extent political, because we give a very clear statement that we refuse this reality as it is. We want to create not even the new reality, because this is postmodern era and we have dropped these lavish, ambitious, humanist, deeply humanist ideas that we need to create a new world. No, we're just going to deal with the illusion now. So we're going to deal with something that is explicitly not real. And the way we do this is quite interesting, because this is where optical art is entirely situated. This is where optical art goes back to pointillism and divisionism, because it uses their scientific method, and it uses this idea that it's going to deal with perception itself. It's going to basically analyze very closely how we see things, how we interact with light, how we interact with colors, how colors behave. Are we talking about light as a wave, or are we talking about light as a particle? So it's going to be quite invested in these questions, and it's going to follow in a very, very strong and all-consuming, all-present notion that we try to simplify, we try to purify, and we try to, how should I put this? We try to reduce our field of interest. Now, this is something that's been happening in human, civilization, arguably, from its very beginning, is that we have been reducing our fields of action, and we have been specializing more and more and more. And this is something that also happens in visual arts, with pointillism and divisionism on one end and optical art on the other. These are artists who refuse to have these global, not to say totalitarian, visions of art, and global and all-consuming works of art. So let's say that when you're looking at a Renaissance or a Baroque painting, you can see that it's a painting that is very complete because it's rife with message, with political and socioeconomic statements, with religious and spiritual potency. You can see that it's a painting that invests a lot into composition, into color harmony, into treatment of light, drawing, line, masses, all these different aspects. So it's basically as if we have taken all of the plasticity and we have placed all of it in one work of art. Whereas, as the time progresses, as the styles progress, we get more and more interest divided into certain categories. So we can say that neoclassical art is clearly more invested into drawing and into line than it is into colors or light as it is. We can then say that in modernity in the 19th and the 20th century, we have these further and further divisions into what a certain artistic formation, stylistical formation, or what a certain artist will be invested in. So if we go back to the heritage of Impressionism and especially Neo-Impressionism, we can also take an example of Monet's Notre Dame de Rouen series, where he represents a cathedral, which we know that it really exists. It's still there in Rouen. It's a majestically large building. He represents it as something that is in constant flux, something that does not have a stable appearance, does not have a stable form, colors, structure, etc. So you could say that it's this plant that grows out of a seed that was planted in Impressionism already, that reality doesn't really exist as such. So this is something that goes back not only to Neo-Impressionism as divisionism, but also to Impressionism itself, is that we don't really get to observe reality. That's not what we do as art spectators or as art creators. It's as Monet said, I'm not painting an object, I'm painting air between myself and an object. We already used this quote and we're likely going to use it again. So it's this idea that we deal with illusion, but we know that we deal with illusion. We are aware of this. We do not pretend that we're creating something real. So this is really important. And for us to deal with this illusion properly, we want to inspect the boundaries and capacities and possibilities of our very perception. Because we cannot properly deal with the illusion if we don't understand the perceptive apparatus that stands on the other end. If we don't understand what is exactly the machine-like body and the machine-like structure of perception that exists within our spectator. So this is exactly what optical art is all about. It's about this idea that we want to see visualization simplified so as to better understand it, and then we want to basically create an illusion out of it. So we want to say that this tendency is not only present in the realm of art, it's also very much present in the realm of philosophy. And indeed, I would argue it's most present in the realm of science, because whilst you had these polymath figures earlier in our history, people who were incredibly proficient in, let's say, math, chemistry, physics, astronomy, botany, and many, many other things, we then stopped having these prodigal figures and prodigious figures, and we started having people who are more and more specialized into a given field. So if you're talking not only about hard sciences, but also about soft sciences, you're talking about, let's say, historians. So people would not make histories of the world quite as much as they have. They would choose smaller and smaller topics to address, and they would try to specialize themselves more, and they would try to get into greater and greater detail. It's a very rare thing that you will see, air quotes, serious historians tackle topics such as the last 1,000 years in history, or the last 2 millennia, or the last century. So this is more conveyed to the domain of popular, as the French people like to say, vulgar or vulgarized art. Sorry, not art, but science. If you're talking about historians, they tend to specialize in one specific field that is increasingly narrow. If you're talking about scientists, people who deal with chemistry, with physics, with biology, they tend to be very, very specialized. If you just read titles of PhD thesis or articles or books that are published, they are a fragment of one domain. And this is something that is increasingly so, in the last couple of thousands of years, really. So you could say that optical art follows this same tendency, that we no longer have these global vast knowledges of things. No, we tend to specialize ourselves, and optical art really is specializing itself in this particular realm of perception and of how we see the world, which is why we call it optical to begin with. Now, I want to go back to this whole idea of illusion that is really important. It really deals with how we see art to begin with. You could argue that art is always, by definition, an illusion, and it really is. It very rarely represents an actual object. I mean, if a work of art represents an actual object, then it's not really fine art, it's applied art. If we say that this spoon is very finely made and it does indeed represent a spoon, well, then it's just a spoon. It's not a work of art. I could bring forward the example of the famous René Magritte painting, This Is Not a Pipe, where he has a pipe and represented, and then below it says this is not a pipe. So of course this is a bit of a joke, it's a bit of an apparent paradox. What he wants to say by it is that this is indeed not a pipe, but a representation of a pipe, and there's a whole difference, and there's the whole world of explanation that comes out of it. So this is basically what we're dealing with here. We are dealing with this whole idea of art as an illusion by definition. And again, you can either look at art as super reality, art as sacred, as part of the ritual, etc., or you can look at it as an illusion. And of course, you can further interpret this in given directions. The idea that art is an illusion, that art to a certain extent is a lie, is not new. It's fairly old. It's really thousands and thousands of years old. And we have some famous people, some famous philosophers and aestheticians that dealt with this. Most important of them, I would argue, was Plato. So what Plato argued in some of his dialogues is that art is a beautiful lie, and that art is actually very damaging to the society because it, by definition, is a lie, and lie is always a bad thing, even if this lie is very pleasant, even if this lie makes us feel great, even if it is very dear to us. Like, let's say, poetry of Homer was very dear to Greek people. They thought it immensely important, and they were right. But Plato says even if it's Homer that we know is a treasure trove of wisdom and good lessons and good morals and all these positive things, even Homer would need to go in his ideal state where there would be no place for art, because it is an illusion. And what philosophers do, they need to lead the society in Plato's ideal state, in his ideal republic, and they need to deal with the truth. This is what philosophers are all about. So seeing how philosophers are the leaders of the society, they have to infuse those values in the rest of the society too. Society needs to deal with truth. They need to be interested in truth. They don't want to be interested in the illusion. So you have this whole famous cave elaborate metaphor where he depicts the cave as the state of mind of most people who live in lies and illusions and are blind to the truth because they're placed in such a position. So Plato argues that all art is to be banned from a perfect state, which is really funny because you can read works of Plato not as philosophy, but really as literature. I would argue even poetry. Plato was a phenomenally gifted writer. And there has been this great dispute between philosophers and philologists to whom Plato belongs more. It doesn't really matter. It belongs to both camps. But it's funny to see how someone who was incredibly gifted and inspired and indeed artistic would completely ban art. He would probably end up banning himself, which, you know, is funny. Now, the thing is that we need to properly take this story back if we want to understand optical art properly, and especially if we want to understand how it relates to Pointillism and Divisionism, to the story not only about Plato but also of Democritus. So what we are dealing with here is this the difference between idealism and materialism, and this is again a very important division. This is the notion idealism, that ideas come first, or materialism, that matter comes first. So if you're an idealist, you think that matter comes after ideas. Ideas are the foundational structure of the universe. If you're a materialist, you think that matter comes first and then ideas are abstracted, created out of matter. The thing that is interesting here is that this particular take on art twists to a certain extent both of these approaches, and it willingly embraces this whole idea of art as an illusion. So you could say that whereas Plato casts art out of his ideal state and his ideal society because it's a lie. These people willingly create it as a lie, and they don't intend to represent it as anything else. They basically own or double down on this criticism, if you will, and it's like, yes, this is exactly what we want to do. We want to create fiction, we want to create illusions. The entire art really is all about illusions. So you could argue that this illusion is a very peculiar type because in many cases it deals with the creation of something that is clearly impossible. Now, why do I say this? A lot of optical art deals with three-dimensional spaces, or rather three-dimensional spaces that are achieved within the borders and within the framework of two-dimensional spaces. Now, of course, there's a lot of optical art sculptures, and they do exist in three-dimensional spaces. But what I'm referring to here primarily are the optic art paintings or two-dimensional works. They don't have to be paintings, they can be drawings. So it's this idea that on a two-dimensional plane, we conveyed the illusion of the three-dimensional space. Now, you could say that this is not a big deal. This is something that we have been dealing with more or less basically since the Renaissance on a very large scale, and then, of course, Baroque and Mannerism and all the other formal representative styles. You could say that the line of horizon and the depth of field were present in the world of art for hundreds of years before optical art. But again, the thing that makes optical art special and that makes it interesting is the fact that they focused on this one aspect and they've dropped all the other ones. So you could say, well, Renaissance art indeed had the depth of space, and it's a very important part of Renaissance art, and it's a very important difference to medieval art. This depth of space and this three-dimensional space that they created within their paintings was cluttered to a certain extent by the message that this work of art was trying to convey. If you, let's say, look at the art of the birth of Christ, or the crucifixion, or the three mages, or any other biblical scene that gets depicted, you could say that you're very likely to focus on that message rather than on visual aspects of that painting, rather than the message itself. And this is exactly what optical art is all about. They don't want to be cluttered by a message, so they are not going to give such names to their paintings. They're going to focus on the visual. And this is how they're similar to abstract art. Of course, you could argue that in most cases optical art is abstract because it's not representative. So you could say that while depth of field and illusion of three-dimensional space existed in the Renaissance and Baroque, in classicism, neoclassicism, it was not really focused on, not to that extent. This was not the sole interest of the artist. Artists that created in those other periods had many other interests as well. Now, it's not only about the three-dimensional space, it's also about the illusion of movement. This is quite interesting, and it takes us back to what we were talking about Cubism, how Cubists were challenged to a certain extent by the invention of cinema, and how cinema was, a grave challenge, not to say offense, to the world of static visual arts because it featured dynamic images. So how do you deal with this? Well, Cubism dealt with it in one way. We already covered this. And optical art dealt with it another way. Now, it's interesting to address also that optical art happens after World War II. And it is really after World War II that cinema, and I would say moving images, rather television than cinema, really, I correct myself there, becomes incredibly important. It becomes much, much more widespread because more and more people get to have a TV set. This was not the case before World War II. You could say that cinema was a big deal, of course, in the 30s, in the 40s, in the 20s even to a certain extent, but things changed drastically with introduction of a television set where you can have moving images inside your own home, inside your own house or an apartment. You don't have to go to the cinema, and that changes everything because cinema is a communal experience. It has this ritualistic air to it, whereas you can just sit alone at your home and watch TV. So this is something that changes the entire game, and it changes basically the approach we have to art, because we want art to be dynamic now, and we want art to challenge and rather respond to the challenge that is represented by moving images. So when you look at optical art, you can see that it often creates optical illusions that art is really moving, whereas whereas we know that it's static. It's static by design. So it's playing tricks with our eyes because we have difficulties recognizing certain patterns and observing certain patterns. So these paintings or drawings look as if they're moving, whereas they're not. Or if we are moving around them, it looks like they're changing shapes, whereas they're not. So this also has to do with the illusion, and it also has to do with the ambition of Greek sculpture that was to feature dynamism, that was to feature spirituality, and was to feature liveness and likeliness of those statues. So when it comes to Greek statues, you could say that in most cases they represented gods or famous important people who won immortality one way or the other. And the whole idea was that with them was that they were supposed to represent continuous living existence of these very important spirits, be they divine daimons or be they famous humans, famous poets or athletes or military leaders, etc. So Greeks had this idea that statues needed to come alive, they needed to be dynamic, they needed to embody movement to a certain extent. And then, of course, they painted their statues. They looked horrible in this shape, such is my personal opinion. The whole idea is that they wanted them to be lifelike. And this is because those statues represented something truly incredibly important. Now, in this particular case, we have optical illusions that move and that represent something that clearly and obviously is not important. It's just an illusion and it's not real. So whereas a Greek statue would be super concentrated essence of reality within a divine figure, this would be an obvious illusion, and it's something that as an illusion we know is to a certain extent meaningless, or is at least devoid of meaning as we tend to see it usually. And all of this has to do, again, with the question of presence, with the question of essence, spirituality that is seen in a very particular manner, and even more so with substance. Now we're getting to the point where we start to address the key influence that was exerted upon this type of art by Heideggerian philosophy. Because Heideggerian philosophy was all about, essence and substance. It was all about our existence being authentic, being lived authentically or not. This is why he was connected to the philosophical school of existentialism in a very important matter. Now, you could say that Heidegger himself spent his entire life writing very complicated, hard to understand books that all dealt with the essence and the question of authenticity. Do we live authentic lives or not? Of course, you could say that he was inspired by Nietzsche, and not to unravel that whole thing. And he was also a Nazi, not to unravel that whole thing. But the main thing is that we understand that Heidegger was formulating within his philosophy what many other artists were formulating within their aesthetics and poetics. And this was the challenge that was brought to us by the Industrial Revolution, the fact that machines separated us from nature, not only when it comes to nature as our immediate environment, but also our human nature. It separated us from our souls, from our beings. It's this idea that you're not only separated from the woods or from the outdoors or things of that nature, you are also separated from yourself. And this is something that people really struggled with after World War II. We found ourselves living in unprecedented comfort and ease. Not to say that it was great, but it was better than anything that came before. But at the same time, we found ourselves living fake lives, and everything became about our lives being boring, our lives being repetitive. Again, we have repetition as a very important thing. You go to your work, you come back from your work, day in, day out. So every day tends to look like the previous and like the next. We feel as if we are devoid of excitement. We don't have anything important happening in our lives. We have just this endless cycle of repetition until we die. And this is not helped by the overly industrial nature of our existences, that we tend to work repetitive jobs. So jobs that most people tend to do are not incredibly enriching. They're not exciting. They're not diverse. They're not terribly different. So they are repetitive in nature. And this is something that optical art deals with. Again, we go back to the question of repetition that is visually very striking and very important. And this question of repetition basically visually asks the question of authenticity, authenticity of existence. Now, if you go back to this notion that art is supposed to be about its time, it's supposed to be about its community, that art is a reflection of its period and era. This is one of the ways in which you can observe art. We're going to deal with that in a different course. Then you say that lives after World War II become quite repetitive, boring, and predictable. So with predictability, with lack of excitement, we start losing our substance. So we are no longer roaming the savannas where everything is out to kill us, where we have poisonous insects or venomous and poisonous animals or large predator animals hunting for us. We are not in this constant state of existential dread. We are basically relaxed and calm, and we know that tomorrow is going to be pretty much the same as today was. So this absolute lack of fear and excitement leads to another form of existential dread, the one that has to do with emptiness and meaningless of our very existences. And this is what Heidegger was all about when he was talking about the sane, when he was talking about the substance of life and the substance of existence, really. So how meaningful it really is and how meaningful, well, it isn't. You could say that this particular art deals with that. It deals with question of authenticity because it willingly serves us illusion. Very purified, very simplified, very strict, and highly repetitive, in many cases, illusion. So you could say that this type of art takes a completely different direction than other forms of art that were still stuck in modernity to a certain extent, that were still busy with trying to create a better world, trying to create new ideas, grandiose projects. Now, you can bring this down to the ideological confrontation that we already talked about that existed during the Cold War, between the eastern part of the world that was communist and the western part of the world that was capitalist. Now, one of the ways in which you can address this is that the communist part of the world, eastern, was still busy with building the brighter future. They were busy with creating the new world. They wanted to create a new humanity, new human, new society, new economy, new everything. So you could argue that they didn't really catch the postmodern train quite as early as their Western contemporaries have. So you could say that postmodernism, at least in arts, was something that started happening in the West much before it started happening in the East. So you could argue that this ideological confrontation was to a certain extent between people who embraced illusion and people who embraced the lack of substance and lack of essence and all these things, and people who were still struggling to achieve some sort of substance, essence, etc. You could argue then that constructivism and suprematism and social realism and social modernism and all these things were still struggling to create new worlds, to create new habitats, new societies, etc. Whereas these people were busy showing how none of that makes any sense, how existence is probably damaged beyond repair, how substance and essence were probably damaged beyond repair, and they've adopted a very different worldview. Now, you could argue that one of major philosophers in this particular line was not just Heidegger, but also Baudrillard, someone who wrote in this particular line where he wrote about the inauthenticity of existence. He wrote about simulacrum famously, and the fact that we do not live original lives, we live copies of copies of copies of lives. So he would argue that artifacts or images, really, or the world as it is that surrounds us, is not original. It's a copy of an original, but it's not even a copy of original. It's a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, and you can place in as many copies as you want. And the idea is that the original is irreparably lost. So original doesn't really exist. We cannot get to it. You can compare this to this whole idea of ritual that we already mentioned has to do with repetition. and that rituals that are highly esteemed are the ones where we can't really trace them to the past. They are lost. They're so old that their origins are lost in the past. So this is very similar to how Baudrillard sees the original authentic existence on one end, and then many different copies that come after it. So he argues that the way we live our lives, the world that surrounds us, is filled with copies of copies of copies. There are no original ideas. We have endless churning of narratives that just keep repeating themselves. And to be honest, if you look at Hollywood production in the last couple of decades, you could say that yes, there's probably some truth to it. You could say that if you study literature, as I have for a while, you can say that after a while you start seeing repetition of certain patterns. After a while you say, okay, I've read this story already, presented in a slightly different manner, but it is really what it is. Now, of course, he's not talking about us not having any ideas. He's really talking about authenticity of existence in the industrial life, and he is talking about the reality of mass media, so he takes a very particular angle. But it is something that is very comparable to what we are talking about, even though chronologically speaking, it comes a bit after. It's a bit a posteriori to what we're talking about now. The whole point is this idea of lacking substance. Now, we come to a very interesting part of this lecture, to me at least, that we see that this particular art and these artists that created in this stylistical formation embrace not the illusion, but they embrace instrumentalization of this illusion. They embrace the complete cynicism that comes with the free market. Now, what I mean by this is that the free market becomes a very important part of the art world. We start having private galleries more and more. We start having private museums more and more. We have corporations investing in artists more and more and more. And very importantly, what happens with optical art is that we have some prominent artists creating some very famous logos. Now, as you probably know, a logo or a logo type, if there's some writing involved, is something that belongs to a company, something that is the visual identity of a company. It represents a certain group. It doesn't have to be a company like a corporation. It can be an association. It can be with any form of group imaginable. But in many cases, we do think about logos as being associated to enterprises. We know some famous examples like the Mercedes logo or the Peugeot logo or Chrysler or Coca-Cola, very famous logo. Not to get into that. Toyota, very famous logo. Sony, etc. So we have this idea that logos are an applied art. If you go and study applied art, graphic arts, back where I come from, the whole chair, the cathedral where you studied, it's called poster and logo. So this is a very important part of graphic design. Now, what happens in the era of optical art is that some prominent artists that really feature this movement design some very famous logos. So we have this idea that these artists come together with the market. They give their services to companies. They apply their skill and their knowledge and they apply their art for commercial means. And we have this crossing of boundaries between fine art on one end and applied arts on the other. So they tend to merge. Now, what I'm talking about, to give a concrete example, is the logo that was created for Woolmark, that is seen by many people as one of the finest logos ever made, if not the best. This was done by Francesco Saroglia, a famous Italian designer. So this is optical art at its finest, and it's used for something that is commercial and that has to do with consumerists, consumer market, with consumerism as a notion, and society that is built upon consumerism. So we can see that art becomes a part of this realm. And this is something that we're going to discuss later when we get to it, how art becomes a part of the market more and more. So we also have Victor Vasarely and his son designing the logo of Renault, the famous, well, I guess in France it's famous, I'm not sure if it's globally the case, car producer. Renault makes many other things next to cars. They make engines, most of all, but it doesn't really matter. It's a very large company. It's a very famous, very important company, a very important part of French economy and French industry is Renault. And their logo is basically optical art. Again, an incredibly well-made logo on one end, an incredibly good example of op art on the other. And we see how art starts losing this privilege, this distinguished position it had before, arguably, World War II. We have this whole line of artists that grew out of symbolism, that grew out of the avant-garde, people who saw themselves as esoteric, mysterious, spiritual, who were dedicated to finding new forms of spirituality, who were dedicating in creating sects and indeed entire new religions. So we have people who are incredibly ambitious in this regard. We already spoke of Kandinsky, of Malevich. We will probably talk about Mondrian. So people who had these incredibly strong spiritual sides to their art, and that they saw themselves as prophets. They saw themselves as godlike figures, as messianic figures even. They thought that art was to become the new religion. And they thought that art had this immensely important role to change the world for the better. Again, we spoke about Malevich and his famous Black Square. This is but one of the examples. Then we see what happens with artists that create optical art. They drop this elevated position. They don't see themselves as prophets anymore. They don't seek to create the better world. They basically start selling their services to the free market through economic enterprise. Now, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with this. I happen to have worked as a graphic designer for a couple of years, and I absolutely love graphic design. I don't think there's anything wrong with applied arts. I would love to eventually come back to this line of work. I am saying that by definition it is different from fine arts, and I am saying that for a very long period of time, or for a couple of centuries at least, we had this buildup of a prophetic, apostolic, if you will, religious figure of an artist. This is something that's been happening more or less, arguably, since the time of classical period in Greece, or if you want to take it to the more modern period, it's arguably been happening from times of mature Renaissance onwards. But right after World War II happens, we have artists who willingly become a part of the free market, and they give their services to economy. They basically render themselves servants of economic interests and of global prosperity. So this is not quite the same as seeing yourself as a herald and a prophet of the new world. You can see the difference. And you can see how with shrinking ambition comes also shrinking notion of self-worth. And with this whole idea that we want to limit our scope of action comes also shrinking ambition. If you think about examples like Bridget Riley or the aforementioned Victor Vasarely, you're talking about people who indeed deal with very, very small limited scopes of visual action. Now, this is not a bad thing at all. This is a decision to be made. Let's say that if you're a physician, you're a medical practitioner, you want to specialize in one field, so you don't want to be a generalist, you want to be, I don't know, a cardiosurgeon or a neurosurgeon or something. This is not a bad thing. You specialize because you're interested in that particular line of work and you want to excel in that limited field. This is just how we do things now. So them specializing is not an issue in itself. What I'm arguing is that this whole idea that artists will design logos is kind of dubious. Now, we could say that old Picasso, who thought very highly of himself, also designed some logos, sometimes even uninvited, but this was done in a very different political climate, and it was done for very different interests. And always it was highly political, and it was a part of politically engaged action and endeavors. So I would argue that it's not quite the same to design, let's say, poster for a war movie that spoke of liberation, or to design a logo for the peace initiative to demilitarize and disarm the world. So that's, I would say, one thing. And the other thing is to just design a logo of a company that sells cars and engines. I see a difference in this. I don't know, you can tell me if you agree or not. The whole thing is that these people simplify, and in simplification they seek to do the same thing as many other people in the 20th century are doing. They're trying to go back to the essence of what art really is, to the very source of what art really is. So you could say that another famous, or perhaps the most famous op artist, Bridget Riley, spoke quite extensively about how she was inspired by ancient Greece, and their rituals. Bacchanalia, how she wanted to name some of her paintings Bacchanalias, but then she wouldn't because it's optical art, it's abstract, so she shouldn't give it such names. So the idea is that they too wanted to go back to the source of art. But the important thing about them is that for them it was always an illusion. So the very source of art for them was not something terribly important, was not reality condensed. No, it was not reality at all. And you can observe the massive shift in how we see things that comes after World War II, that comes with postmodernism. You can see this shrinking ambition. You can see how artists do not think as highly of them as artists just a couple of decades prior have done. I hope this was instructive. I hope this made sense. I also hope to see you again soon. Have a nice day and talk to you soon. Ciao.